Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Hello and welcome to It's Murder Up North. Continuing our slight departure from the Wakefield Prison series, this will be the second of 3 episodes featuring crimes that took place in 1974 in the northeast of England. Last week I detailed the case of 8-year-old Julia Brown in South Shields, and while we shall return to that side of the River Tyne for next week's instalment, today I will take you across the water to the opposite shore and North Shields. Looming above the shoreline, close to where the river meets the sea, stands the Sir James Knott Memorial Flats, more commonly known as Knott's Flats. From the windows of this building, residents in 1974 could have looked across the River Tyne and seen the Velva liquid site on the opposite bank, unaware that the body of 17-year-old Eileen McDougall lay concealed within one of the fuel tanks. In August 1974, tragedy would come within feet of their own homes, as a murder occurred, which left the community reeling and a family still seeking answers. Join me as I delve into the case of Gary Shields, an animal-loving 6-year-old whose death has left a lasting scar upon his loved ones, including the siblings, nieces and nephews he never got to meet. The fortress-like structure of Knott's Flats occupies an elevated position on the northern shore of the River Tyne. Made up of 135 residences split over 6 stories, it was built in the 1930s and had originally housed tenants displaced by the slum clearances in the town of North Shields. The distinctive curving structure was fronted by a flat grassed area. This slipped away into a grassy embankment that then sloped steeply down to a promenade which runs along the river's edge. To the structure's rear, beyond its car park, there passed a railway line which runs parallel with Tynemouth Road. To the left of the flats stands a small bungalow, a nursery school and a street known as River View, which in the 1970s was occupied primarily by terraced houses, a shop and a burnt-out building which had once been the local chip shop. By the end of the decade, the properties would disappear, to be replaced by new housing. But in 1974, number 25 Riverview was where 6-year-old Gary Shields resided with his family, Mum Violet, Dad Kelvin, his older brother Lawrence, aged 8, and his younger sibling Alan, aged 5. The 6-year-old, who was a pupil at Priory Infant School, was a friendly little boy with a love of animals. He took care of his 3 budgies and the family's black and white collie. It was a menagerie he had added to when his father fulfilled his promise of getting his son 2 guinea pigs and a white mouse. These new pets had been exhibited to his neighbours with gleeful delight, as Gary also gushed with great excitement to whoever would listen about his upcoming trip to a wildlife park with his family. With the school holidays underway, Saturday the 3rd of August 1974 was just an ordinary, relaxing day. That morning, Gary got dressed in a pair of grey short trousers with blue braces pulled up over his grey shirt, and he put on a pair of brown sandals before leaving his home accompanied by his siblings. Throughout the day, the little blonde-haired boy with a cheeky smile was observed happily playing close to the house. Yet as the afternoon approached, he separated from his brothers, and later that day his siblings returned home, but Gary didn't. His worried parents set out to look for him with the assistance of his grandfather Edward and uncle Matthew. But at 8 p.m, the family had less than an hour of sunlight remaining. The threat of the encroaching darkness caused their fears to grow, and unable to locate Gary, the family turned to the police for help. A full-scale search would be launched that evening, but as dawn began to break over the River Tyne the following day, Constable Billy Dixon, who had been searching the steep embankment that divided Knott's Flats from the water's edge, made a discovery. Just 100 yards from Gary's home, he found the small, pale and unclothed body of a child, concealed in a clump of bushes, with his only companions being a discarded boiler, a bedsheet and a dress. The location was swiftly cordoned off as forensic teams were brought in to locate any clues that may have been left by the killer. Meanwhile, officers were deployed to seek out potential witnesses, with the 135 flats which overlooked the site being the most obvious place to start. They would not be alone in their efforts, as Gary's father, uncle and grandfather continued their own search for answers. Meanwhile, Gary's tiny body was taken from the scene, and a post-mortem was conducted. The examination determined that the child had endured a sexual assault, and his killer had placed their hand over the boy's mouth, with the cause of death being a combination of suffocation and heart failure. The pathologist was also able to deduce that the death had occurred roughly between 6 and 8 p.m. the previous evening, which was around the time Gary's family would have been out searching for him. Over 80 officers worked to garner information, while a press conference was held, headed by the lead investigator, Detective Sergeant Brian Johnson, who stated that the killing was, quote, a callous murder of a lively, attractive little boy. The officer continued by appealing to parents in the local community to come forward if their child had encountered anyone behaving untoward, while also warning that no child should be out of their home unaccompanied. Regarding the death, D.S. Johnson advised they believed that the murder had taken place elsewhere, and the body had been deposited at the site afterwards. He would also provide details of an individual they wished to speak to. The officer revealed that at 9:25, on the night Gary went missing, a 999 call was placed by a man who alleged he had discovered a body behind Knott's Flats. The caller was said to sound like a young male with a local accent, but the address and name he provided turned out to be false, and despite being asked to remain at the phone box, which was located opposite the flats, the man was gone when an officer arrived. Police followed up on the tip and searched the area indicated by the caller, but they did not find the body. While the hunt for this individual continued, police spoke to witnesses who had seen Gary that Saturday afternoon, and they were able to build a timeline that indicated that the last sighting of him was at around 4 p.m, but they still had many gaps to fill in. Like the officers who had been investigating the murder of Julia Brown in South Shields just 5 months earlier, the police pondered how Gary had come into contact with his killer. Was it a stranger or someone who knew him? The boy's grandmother, Mrs. Alma Shields, pointed out the possibility that her grandson's love of animals was used to lure the child, with her stating, Gary was animal daft, and when his father brought him the pets, he was delighted. She added, I can't help feeling that his killer may have taken advantage of this enthusiasm to win his trust. Yet there was another alternative, as other children in the area had reported that they had been approached by a man that Saturday afternoon, who offered them £1 if they joined him for a walk. Although these children had declined, detectives had to consider the prospect that Gary had accepted the offer. Unfortunately, the youngsters who had encountered this man had been unable to compile a definitive description. However, a phone line was made available for parents to contact the police if their child had been approached or had seen someone acting suspiciously. At the initial press conference, Gary's father, Kelvin, advised those present that his quiet son, who was small for his age, quote, often played on his own but was always nearby, adding that Gary had never gone missing before, and neighbours and friends helped us look for him. His mother Violet and I are both shattered by the whole thing. She is under sedation. With the family struggling to come to terms with Gary's death, the investigation continued in hopes the killer would be caught. 3 days after Gary's murder, more details were released regarding the young man who had called 999 on that Saturday night. Unable to trace him, the police once again appealed for the individual to come forward, revealing that emergency calls are automatically recorded. Therefore, the man's voice would be on tape, and it would be in his best interest, especially if he was an innocent bystander, to contact the police and disclose what he had seen. A possible clue to the identity of this mystery caller came from Gary's father Kelvin and uncle Matthew, with the pair recalling that while searching for the 6-year-old, they had observed a young man with a beard and shoulder-length hair in the vicinity of the phone box, going on to describe that the man was wearing a blue top. As police continued their search for the unknown caller, Gary's family took it upon themselves to conduct their own inquiries. And while Violet and her 2 sons resided with relatives elsewhere, Gary's father Kelvin, accompanied by his father Edward and his brother Matthew, patrolled the riverside. Following the water's edge, they walked for miles in search of clues, but all they were able to find was an army cartridge, which Gary always carried with him. Speaking to the press, Kelvin explained his quest for answers, stating, "We are looking for anything that might help catch the man. We are asking nearly everybody we see walking about in the hope they might have seen something. We are going to keep searching till they catch the murderer." The fear that the killer was still on the loose had caused a wall of protection to be placed around the local children, with parents establishing strict rules which only permitted their youngsters to play in groups, and they were to be supervised at all times by an adult, with mothers arranging to take it in turns to watch over them as they played. It has also been made clear that the embankment on which Gary had been found was now off limits, preventing the children from gathering in an area they had previously favoured, with them often playing there while others would camp out for the night on the grassy slopes. But the mothers acknowledged that they had grown wary of the embankment. They had raised complaints that it had become unkempt and overgrown, and in turn it had started to attract some unsavoury characters and behaviours, including courting couples, the homeless, and drunks. One mother, Mrs. Margaret Watson, who had 3 young children, spoke of the adults' discomfort regarding the sloped area between the flats and the river, and the individuals who had begun to loiter there, stating, "You can always hear them around here. It has worried everybody with bairns, different men wandering around. The bairns all play there and camp out because they have nowhere else to go, but the land should have been fenced off or tidied up." Perhaps the anxiety of the residents was eased slightly when news broke that Tuesday evening that a man was assisting the police with their inquiries, and 2 days later he would make his first appearance in court. On Thursday the 8th of August 1974, 23-year-old Paul Hales, a labourer who resided on Holne Avenue, less than half a mile from the Shields family home, appeared for a 2-minute hearing, during which he was remanded in custody, charged with the murder of Gary. With Hales on remand at Durham Prison, the onus was now on the police to acquire further evidence to secure a conviction, and there were 2 items they were eager to identify, those being the 2 garments recovered from beside Gary's body. The police were keen to ascertain where they had originated from, particularly as this may help lead them to where the murder had occurred. A description of the fabrics was issued in the Newcastle Journal on the 15th of August, with the paper describing the first piece being a quote beige or cream rayon bedspread, about 96 inches by 92 inches. It had 4 equally sized panels stitched with off-white thread, but one had been repaired with white cotton and another with red. A laundry tag, YB88, is fixed on one corner. The second piece they added was a dark pink smock or overall, which has a button-up front with white buttons. There is a pocket on the right-hand side at about hip level. This appeal was made amidst one of the hardest days a parent could ever face, having to say goodbye to their child. A large crowd of mourners gathered at Preston Cemetery, despite the rain, solemnly taking their seats in the small chapel before heading to the graveside, which was adorned with flowers, bouquets and wreaths from family, friends and neighbours. Teachers and classmates all gathered to silently observe as the tiny coffin was lowered into the ground. The burial of their child would not provide closure, as the loved ones still had to endure the details of Gary's death when the trial commenced on Wednesday the 29th of January 1975. One of the first actions taken by the court was for the 12 male jury members, accompanied by the defence, prosecution, judge and court officials, to be escorted to the banks of the River Tyne. They were led to the spot on the embankment where Gary's body had been found, and were able to see the location, its proximity to the flats, and the risk the killer took to carry out the crime in such a visible and well-trodden place. Returning to Newcastle Crown Court, prosecutor Mr. Barry Mortimer QC told the jury that the defendant, Paul Hales, was known to the Shields family, as the 23-year-old labourer had assisted the boy's father in the task of digging up worms ready for a fishing trip. The prosecutor went on to detail what 6-year-old Gary had done during Saturday the 3rd of August, providing a description of an innocent child who was enjoying the warmth of summer while playing near his home. During the afternoon, he and his siblings had parted ways, and sometime between 6:15 and 6:30, the brothers returned home without him. With his tea ready and the boy missing, a cursory search about the nearby streets was begun. At 7:30 p.m, the Shields were still out looking for Gary, but each minute he was absent induced greater anxiety. Meanwhile, 10-year-old Ian Brown had left his home at Knott's Flats to go to the shop on Riverview for his mother. It was while on the street where Gary lived that Ian saw the 6-year-old standing outside the burnt-out shell of Bob's fish and chip shop, and having heard the boy's family calling for him, Ian told Gary, quote, "Your mum wants you, I'll take you home." Ian walked with Gary to a lane alongside the chip shop, and he followed the youngster, observing as the child knocked on the back door of his home at number 25 Riverview. Believing Gary was home safe, Ian left, but Gary did not gain entry to the property. With his parents out looking for him, his 15-year-old Aunt Yvonne and his younger brother Alan were sat in the flat watching television, unaware that the sound, despite it being low, was drowning out Gary's little knocks, and unable to reach the latch, he was stranded on the doorstep. Mr. Mortimer told the court, "We do not know what happened, but the certainty is that Gary did not stay there." He went on to state that they estimated that this occurred between 7:30 and 7:50, but they do not know why Gary did not wait on the doorstep. The prosecutor then turned to the movements of the defendant that evening, advising the jury that 23-year-old ginger-haired Hale was a familiar figure around the area, and he was rarely seen without Flash, his beloved brown and black dog. One of the first sightings of Hale that evening was at roughly 7:10, as he walked along Shipley Road with his dog trotting along beside him. This was not far from his home on Holne Avenue, where it is believed he left the dog, as by 7:30 the animal was no longer with him. It was around this time Hales had been seen by several witnesses, including a group of teenagers, who were walking on the path which ran between the caretaker's cottage and Knott's Flats, from which one could access both Riverview and the embankment where Gary's body was found. The teenagers had placed Hales in a location less than 450 feet away from where Gary was stood on his doorstep, making it possible that the pair could have crossed paths. An hour after being seen at the caretaker's cottage, Hales was observed walking on the same footpath and was once again unaccompanied by his dog. Shortly after this, he was seen walking past the shop where Ian Brown had been just a couple of hours earlier. It was surmised by the prosecution that Hales likely returned home at some point between this sighting and 11:20, as the next time he was seen was by a resident of Knott's Flats, who recalled Paul passing the caretaker's cottage, while another noticed him walking in the opposite direction past their ground floor flat roughly 5 minutes later with his loyal dog. Notably, all these sightings placed Paul close to the area where Gary's body was found, but it was also within a 3-minute walk of the telephone box located outside the Marina's home on Tynemouth Road, when the 999 call was made at 9:25 p.m. The court would hear further details of this call, during which a male asked, "Can I have some assistance, please, at Tynemouth? My son has been out tonight and there has been a body found." Giving his name as Mr. Adamson of 4 Riverview, the caller went on to state that the remains were beneath some leaves at the back of Knott's Flats. When a police vehicle arrived at the phone box, the caller had left the area, despite being instructed to stay put. And while they did not locate a Mr. Adamson at the address provided, they did find an individual by that name at 41A Riverview. And they were able to ascertain that Hales was acquainted with this man, with it being surmised that the name was probably used as the first thing that came into Hales' mind. Mr. Mortimer proceeded to state the prosecution's speculation regarding what happened in the time between Hales being seen without his dog at 7:30 and the 999 call at 9:25 p.m. The prosecution suggested that at some point after Hales had been seen walking past the caretaker's cottage at around 7:30 p.m, he had encountered Gary, with the prosecution suggesting that they probably met at the top of the embankment behind Knott's Flats. The prosecution went on to state that at some point, and for reasons unknown, Hales struck Gary across the face, as was evidenced by bruising found during the post-mortem, with the 23-year-old then clasping his hand over the boy's mouth, perhaps in an attempt to keep the youngster quiet. Yet this action resulted in the slightly built 6-year-old falling unconscious, and in this condition he was carried by Hales down the slope to the bushes, the canopy of which provided cover from the prying eyes in the flats above. And it was amongst this seclusion that Hales undressed the boy and proceeded to assault him. It was this that contributed to Gary's death, as his body's reaction to this horrific act caused the heart of the 6-year-old to fail. Mr. Mortimer then surmised that Hales left the deceased child unclothed and alone amidst the bushes, and made his way back up the embankment, possibly holding the boy's clothes, although these garments have never been found. Shortly after this, the defendant walked past a group of teenagers before heading on to Tynemouth Road, and possibly returning to his home roughly a 6-minute walk away on Hone Avenue. It is believed that Hales returned to the site of the murder 2 more times before he made the phone call to the police. While witnesses were able to place Hales near the location of the murder, forensic evidence from the scene would, as the prosecution argued, prove that he had been in contact with the body. They pointed to fibres found on an old boiler and some similar ones recovered from the body, which had been linked to the material of the trousers Hales had been wearing that night. Mr. Mortimer concluded his opening statement, and the following day saw the first witnesses take to the stand, led by Gary's mother, Violet. She recounted the last time she had seen Gary, at 11:30 a.m. on that Saturday morning, remembering her 6-year-old son happily kicking about a football in the back lane, while his brothers were playing further down the street, a short distance away but still within sight. Violet went on to recount that at around 6 p.m. she knew something was wrong, as Gary had not come in for his tea when his brothers did, prompting her to go out and look for him, leaving her youngest son Alan and sister Yvonne in the house in case Gary returned. While searching, Violet remembered being approached by 2 boys who had found a toy gun holster that belonged to Gary. They had found this at the foot of a cliff near Fish Quay, less than 10 minutes' walk from his home, but having searched this area, they found no signs of the 6-year-old. Her testimony then focused on an incident which had occurred in the weeks prior to Gary's death, as the mother recalled that her son had told her that a 14-year-old boy whom he had often played with had behaved inappropriately towards him. After speaking to the teenager's mother, Gary was told not to play with the boy again, but the police were only made aware of this incident in the aftermath of the murder. While under cross-examination by the defence counsel, Mr. Francis Irwin QC, Violet Shields was asked whether she was aware that during interviews with the police, The 14-year-old who Gary had complained about had confessed to the murder. The mother replied that she had no knowledge of this occurring. While this is an intriguing aspect of the case, I've found no further reference regarding it during my research. After this cross-examination, Violet's time on the stand came to an end. She would be followed into the box by her husband Kelvin, who spoke of how the family initially became concerned for Gary's whereabouts when their younger son, 5-year-old Alan, came home alone. This struck them as unusual, as the two brothers had a close bond and did almost everything together. The father went on to detail the search efforts, recalling that they visited all of Gary's favoured spots and walked down to where the toy holster had been found by the two teenagers. Mr. Shields added further details while under cross-examination, with him stating that between 6:30 and 8:30 he had been searching the embankment, walked down to Fish Key and back, and had visited several other locations Gary was known to frequent. Concluding his testimony by stating that during his searches he did not see or hear anything unusual, and did not notice any activity in or around the thicket where the body of his son was found the next morning. There then came several witnesses who had seen Gary throughout the day, including Mr. Kenneth Woodhouse, a neighbour of the family who recalled seeing the Shields siblings playing together between 1 and 1:30 that afternoon, going on to advise that he had been at home until 5:20 reading a book. During his questioning, Mr. Woodhouse was also shown the garments which had been recovered from the crime scene, the bedspread and the smock, with it being noted that marks on the fabrics were believed to have come from the body. Mr. Woodhouse advised that they did not appear to be ones owned by his mother, and he could not recall anything resembling them being hung on their washing line that day. He also confirmed that he had not seen or heard anyone entering their backyard where the washing line was located while he was inside the house. The reason he was asked about someone being in his backyard would become apparent when it was revealed that these items were traced back to his house, with Mrs. Gladys Woodhouse telling the court that they had been placed on her washing line the day before the murder, going on to state that, "I did not notice they were missing until a policeman showed them to me some days afterwards." Another Riverview resident stated that she too had seen Gary that afternoon. This time the evidence was provided by 9-year-old Susan Ham, who had been in the sitting room of her family home when at around 7:30 she observed Gary and his brother Alan pass by, heading in the direction of Knott's Flats. When asked how sure she was regarding the timing of this sighting, the young girl responded that she knew it had occurred just before she was due to go to bed, which she did prior to her mother leaving the home at 8 o'clock. However, this sighting did seem to contradict other testimony, which stated that Alan was at home by this time, and the sighting of another witness would suggest that Gary had been alone at around 7:30. This critical sighting was provided by 10-year-old Ian Brown, the little boy who had been sent out to the shop from his home in Knott's Flats. Ian recalled that he left home when the clock said 7:30 p.m. and headed to the shop located on Gary Street. As he walked to the shop, Ian had heard the voice of whom he assumed was Gary's mother calling for her son, but he did not see the child until after he exited the shop, noting that the 6-year-old was sitting on the steps of the burnt-out fish and chip shop. Ian proceeded to explain that he told Gary his mother was looking for him, and he agreed to accompany the little boy home, following him down the lane which passed beside the chip shop. However, Ian recalled that Gary momentarily disappeared from view. Heading off to the right, the little boy seemed to go around the block of houses and reappeared on the left-hand side of the lane. When Ian asked where the boy had been, Gary told him that he had gone to see if his friend was there, yet no further mention of this friend was made as Ian and Gary approached the back door of number 25 Riverview, where the Shields family resided. Ian did not wait to see if the door was answered. Having seen Gary safely to the doorstep, he turned and headed back towards his house at Knott's Flats. This was the last known sighting of the 6-year-old. It is not certain why Gary left the doorstep instead of waiting to be let in. Had he assumed no one was home and went looking for his family who were calling for him? Had he gone to find another way into the house? Or had his killer lured him away? More witnesses would provide evidence, this time placing Hales in close proximity to where Gary had last been seen. The first to testify was Wendy Greggs, who stated she and a group of friends had been at the top of the embankment behind the flats when at 7:30 they saw Hales walking without his dog, heading along the path which ran alongside the flats towards the car park. This meant that Hales was moving in the direction of Gary's last known location, with the insinuation being that the pair likely crossed paths shortly after this sighting. However, Wendy would state that she and her friends did not hear anything, which would signal that an attack was taking place. Having provided statements which placed Hales and Gary within the same vicinity, the prosecution then called upon the testimony of the officers who conducted the interviews with the defendant upon his arrest. Acting Detective Sergeant John Gibbons, DS Philip Dolan, and DC Malcolm Hall. The three officers had attended the Oxford Street Coal Depot at 1:30 on Monday, August 5, 1974, where Hales was employed, and they were looking to question him regarding his whereabouts on the night Gary disappeared. Hales claimed he had been in the vicinity of Riverview and Knott's Flats at around 7 o'clock that night, but then he had headed home. Shortly afterwards, he purchased some cigarettes from the Dolphin pub on King Edward Road, approximately a 5-minute walk from his house and in the opposite direction of Knott's Flats. He went on to explain that after leaving the pub, he returned home, where he remained until 9:15, when he went out to walk his dog. Hales claimed he had no further information for the three officers, informing them, quote, "I would help if I could, but I didn't see anything." When asked if he had contacted the police that night, Hales stated the only phone call he had made was to a friend in Newcastle from a box at Time of Train station earlier that afternoon. Hales' demeanour was notable to the officers, as with each question the 23-year-old grew increasingly anxious. He began stammering and stumbling over his words, and having agreed to accompany them to the station to make a formal statement, his unease seemed to escalate during the car ride, with DS Dolan recalling that while in conversation, the defendant kept inserting "you know" within his sentences. Once within the interview room, it wasn't long before his anxiety overwhelmed him, as Hales was informed that he sounded like the individual who had made the 999 call. This prompted the 23-year-old to cry and exclaimed, "It was horrible, horrible." Through his tears, Hales conceded that he had discovered the body, and it was him that made the call to the police regarding what he had found. With this admission disclosed to the court, the witnesses left the stand, replaced by pathologist Dr. Jack Ennis. He would provide details regarding the post-mortem, and expressed his belief that, quote, "the boy may have been attacked, killed, and dumped in the bushes," although he could not confirm with certainty that the attack had occurred at the spot where the body was found, conceding it was possible the murder had taken place elsewhere and the body had been brought to the site afterwards. The pathologist added that the attack likely took place between 6 and 8 p.m. that Saturday evening. He detailed that there was bruising on Gary's face, indicative of him being struck by a hand, and that further markings suggested that the assailant had placed a hand over Gary's mouth and nose, restricting the boy's ability to breathe, leading to suffocation. Dr. Ennis stated there were indications that the sexual assault occurred prior to death. However, the lack of any defensive wounds or signs that the boy had scratched his attacker suggested that the assault took place while the boy was incapacitated, and death had occurred shortly afterwards. Alongside the harrowing details of the post-mortem, the jury would be made privy to further details of Hales's police interviews, as Detective Inspector Norman Thompson addressed the courtroom, recalling that during questioning, the defendant had admitted to finding Gary's body at 7:30 on that Saturday evening, 2 hours prior to making the 999 call. Hales had described to them that while out walking with his dog, the animal ran into the thicket and would not return, so he had gone to retrieve him. Within the bushes he observed that someone had discarded of a boiler or spin dryer, and beside this was the body, lying face down and unclothed. Hales described what he saw to the officers as awful, adding that he was frightened by it. Having recounted this conversation to the court, D.I. Thompson was asked by prosecutor Mr. Mortimer whether Hales had been made aware of the appearance or location of the body, to which the officer replied that he had not told the defendant these details. The officer continued his testimony by recalling that Hales had claimed that after finding the body, he had been unsure what to do, and had walked home to think, admitting that it was only after a couple of hours that he decided he needed to inform the police. Therefore he headed to the phone box which stood close to the Marina Homes on Tynemouth Road. During the interview, Hales stated that the name Adamson, which he provided to the call handler, was just the first thing that came to his mind, and he couldn't recall knowing anyone by that name. However, as I stated earlier, the police had discovered someone by that name who said they were acquainted with the 23-year-old, with this detail likely causing the police to be more sceptical of his account. Hales also explained that he had been instructed to stay at the phone box by the operator, and although he did not comply, he was loitering near Knott's flats and saw the police car arrive, and upon seeing the police car arrive, he made his way home. However, during a second interview, Hales changed his testimony. Having spent the initial part of the questioning staring at the floor and refusing to speak, his resolve broke, and upon declaring he would tell the officers the truth, he admitted that he hadn't been walking his dog when he found the body. Instead, he'd been to the Dolphin pub on King Edward Street, where he purchased some cigarettes before deciding to take a walk along the embankment which ran between the river and Knott's Flats. He claimed that as he walked, he observed an object protruding from the thicket, and out of curiosity he went to take a closer look, only for him to find the deceased child. But the interviewing officers questioned the accuracy of this statement by informing Hales that from where he was stood on the embankment, he would not have been able to see the body, which was concealed by the thick bushes surrounding it. They were also aware that no one who had been out searching that night had been able to see the body from the top of the embankment. When the officers pointed out this detail that the body was not visible from this location, it brought on another spell of Hales staring at the floor, his head shaking and him exclaiming, I can't. Patiently, the officers waited until Hales regained some composure, and listened as he spun another story of how he found the body, but cautioned them that, quote, it is embarrassing. He told them he'd gone out without his dog, and intended to buy cigarettes at the Dolphin pub, but while there he stayed and drank 4 pints, before heading off for a walk along the top of the embankment, meaning he had to walk close to his home in order to reach that location. This made the next part of his claim seem dubious, as after walking the short distance between his house and the embankment, Hales alleged that he realised he needed to relieve himself, and with the thicket being one of the only secluded spots he could see, he clambered down the slope, but when he reached the bushes he found the body. His rationale for going down the slope was questioned, with the police interviewers pointing out that the bushes where he sought to relieve himself were in a difficult place to access. And after another few moments of silence, Hales replied, No, that is not the truth either. Having now provided the police with a trio of differing statements, with all featuring dubious recollections, Hales started to cry, and grabbed hold of the interviewer's hand and told them, quote, I can't, I'm too ashamed. But when questioned, he would not say what he was ashamed of and sat silently shaking his head. Almost an hour later, after a break in the interview, Hales returned to the room and was asked whether he was willing to disclose what actually occurred. As with the previous sessions, it took Hales some time to begin, with him stating, "You're right, this time I'll tell the truth." In his fourth statement, the visit to the pub without his dog remained the same, except the number of pints changed from 4 to 1. He proceeded to explain that at 7 o'clock he left the Dolphin pub and, as previously stated, took the route along the embankment, where he headed down to the bushes and saw the child lying there. Hale claimed he went home, but at around 9 o'clock he took his dog for a walk and he headed down to the thicket, and having confirmed that the body was really there, he contacted the police. Under cross-examination, D.I. Thompson would be questioned regarding Hale's mental state and his capacity to understand what was taking place, with the defence counsel, Mr. Francis Irwin QC, disclosing that, having been assessed, Hales was found to have the mind of a 10-year-old. The defence also revealed that while in police custody, Hales had attempted to use a sock to strangle himself. Asked if he was aware that Hales did not have the ability to fully comprehend the situation, D.I. Thompson admitted that he wasn't, citing, quote, "As far as I was concerned, he was a 23-year-old adult. He was articulate and could read and write well." The officer continued by stating that had he been aware of such issues, an appropriate adult would have been brought in to sit with Hales during the interviews, adding, "And if that person wanted to have a solicitor for Hales, I would have made the necessary arrangements." The court also heard that during 12 hours in police custody, Hales was interviewed by 3 different officers. He demonstrated signs of emotional distress, and aside from his differing statements, he would also make a verbal confession, although even these admissions featured varying accounts regarding details such as the manner in which he had disposed of Gary's clothing, with the defendant allegedly providing 9 different versions. The defence counsel continued their cross-examination by questioning the manner of the interviews conducted with Hales. Mr. Francis claimed that over the 12 hours he was being held, the defendant had repeatedly stated he was innocent. Yet it was alleged that one of the interviewing officers, D.I. Thompson, had repeatedly replied to these assertions by stating that he didn't believe Hales was being truthful. It was insinuated that undue pressure may have been applied during the interviews, which caused Hales to confess. However, D.I. Thompson refuted this by advising that the questioning was thorough, but whenever Hales entered an emotional state, they would take a break and the suspect was offered refreshments and a chance to regain his composure before proceeding. Having established that Hales had the mental understanding of a 10-year-old, consultant psychiatrist Dr. Hamish McLennan would take to the stand to clarify this by advising that following an assessment it was determined that the defendant had severe personality disorders. He was a fantasist who made up scenarios to create a facade that his life was normal but interesting. One such tale revolved around his claim that he had travelled at 90 miles an hour on a motorbike, while he had also told acquaintances he had 2 children and was soon to be divorced. Dr. McLennan stated that the latter seemed to be Hale's favoured delusion. The doctor continued by stating that although the defendant was literate, he had a low intelligence, while his personality disorder affected his ability to socialise, noting that Hales also struggled to control his actions when he entered a highly emotional state. Dr. McLennan advised that without his fantasies, Hales would come across as an uninteresting individual, but he had also found that during conversations he had held with the 23-year-old, the defendant would seek to say the right thing to ingratiate himself and seemed eager to please. Regarding the strain the police interviews would have had on someone like Hales, Dr. McLennan stated that even a person not dealing with the issues Hales faced would have found the prolonged pressure hard to take. They may confess purely to bring an end to what would feel like relentless questioning. On Monday the 10th of February, the jury would hear from Paul Hales, the man who had confessed while in police custody, only to retract his statement and take to the stand proclaiming his innocence. Hales would recite his movements on the day of the murder, stating that at around 20 to 7, he had left his home on Holne Avenue and headed to the Dolphin pub, where he bought some cigarettes and consumed 1 pint. He left the pub at 5 to 7 and returned home to collect his dog, and went for a walk on King Edward's Beach, roughly 16 minutes away from his home. Once there, he stopped for an ice cream by the bathing pools before heading back to his home, between roughly 7:30 and 7:45. This was the time Gary was knocking on the door of his house. However, Hales would insist that he did not go near Riverview, Knott's Flats or Fish Quay, the latter being close to where Gary's toy gun holster was found. Hales proceeded to explain to the court that he left his home to meet a friend at Knott's Flats at around 8:30, but on this occasion he did not take his dog. He recalled waiting for his friend for around 20 minutes, telling the court, "I was standing on the bank just above the bushes where I found Gary's body," adding, "This is rather embarrassing. I wanted to empty my tank. I had been drinking." He claimed that the only private spot in the area for him to use was a thicket located on the slope, and unable to hold it in for much longer, he made his way down the steep embankment, and upon getting to the bushes, he saw the body and fled. Hales told the court, "I got such a fright. I didn't realise he'd been sexually assaulted." The 23-year-old went on to state that he left the scene and opted to sit on a wall opposite the telephone box, where he contemplated whether to call the police, conceding that he was afraid to do so, resulting in him heading home. Hales recalled he had been in the house for a couple of hours, when at roughly 9:15 his mother asked him what was wrong, with him telling the jury that she, quote, "did notice I was in a bit of a state." But Hales did not confide in his mother. Instead, he put the dog on its lead and headed out to see if his friend was at the back of Knott's Flats. But upon arrival, he saw no sign of his acquaintance, so he let the dog off its lead and went for a walk. He passed by a group of girls playing along the way, to whom his dog took a liking, causing Hales to have to retrieve the animal and put it back on the lead. After which, he continued his walk, heading past the nursery school, where he then let the dog off the lead once more. As he approached the spot where the thicket was, he felt the urge to return to the bushes, stating, "I was walking and I just went to make sure that what I'd seen was a body, because I just could not believe it." Upon seeing the remains again, he admitted he was certain it was a reality, and he made his way to the phone box and called the police at 9:25 p.m. As the trial approached its 11th day, Hale returned to the dock, this time to face cross-examination from prosecutor Mr. Mortimer QC. The first set of questions focused on the differing verbal and written statements made by the defendant to the police. But when asked why his stories were inconsistent, Hales replied, "That I cannot answer." Addressing the account Hales had settled on, Mr. Mortimer asked why he hadn't maintained this version of events throughout his police interviews, but once again Hales claimed he had no explanation. Mr. Mortimer then became more direct in his questioning of the accused, putting to Hale that, quote, "The truth of the matter is that you did not find the body, you took the boy there." Hales denied this, but then was asked to explain why, during a break in the police interview, he had confided in D.I. Thompson and had proclaimed, I did it, but I can't tell you about it, Mr. Thompson." Hale admitted that this had occurred, but he told the court, "I did actually say that, but in actual fact, I didn't kill the boy." When asked why, having initially confessed to causing the boy's death, Hale then proceeded to tell officers several accounts of what occurred, he conceded that all these statements had been lies, induced by being told he was going to be held on suspicion of murder, causing him to feel his position was hopeless. As the prosecution ended their questioning of Hale, the defence stepped up to ask their client a few more questions, including an inquiry regarding his mental state during the police interviews. In particular, what he was thinking when he confessed. Hales replied, "There was nothing going through my mind, really." With the defence's approach being built upon Hales's mental capacity, they called upon the expertise of consultant psychiatrist Dr. John Hawkins. who expressed his view that any statement made by Hale was unreliable due to his personality defects, going on to state he believed this was particularly the case when considering claims made while the defendant was in an upsetting or stressful situation. Dr. Hawkins went on to advise that the prolonged and intensive questioning of Hales by the police would likely be a situation which would induce the defendant to create a false narrative or repeatedly change his story, especially if he felt that by confessing he would make the pressure stop. The doctor concluded that Hales had an abnormality of the mind, which impaired his ability to think or behave in a rational or responsible manner. Having established their client's mental capacity, the defence went on to call witnesses who could attest that between 6 and 8 p.m. when the murder was said to have occurred, Hale wasn't near the location where the body was found. By the testimony of Mrs. Stephanie George Liu, the defence were able to place Hales crossing the footbridge at time of station at 6:45, heading towards Front Street and King Edward's Beach, where Hales had claimed he purchased an ice cream. This was in the opposite direction of the crime scene. He was next seen at 7:35 on Bertley Avenue, an 8-minute walk away from the embankment where the body was found, and close to his own home on Holne Avenue. Mrs. Patience Morton, a neighbour of Hales who had spoken to him on Bertley Avenue, recalled, "I said hello to him and he said hello to me. He had his dog with him, but it was off the lead." These testimonies suggested that Hales was not in the vicinity of Knott's Flats at the time the murder was believed to have occurred. But were these sightings enough to cause the jury to question whether Hales was guilty of murder? After an exhaustive trial, the prosecution and defence provided their closing arguments before Judge Crichton delivered his summing up. Addressing the jury of 12 men, the judge advised them not to be guided by emotion when considering their verdict, with them being asked to ponder whether prosecutor Mr. Barry Mortimer had proved beyond reasonable doubt that Paul Hales was guilty of causing Gary's death. Or was Hales, as the defence claimed, a man with the understanding of a child, who had confessed only because he had found himself in a stressful situation? Did they believe that this was an admission of guilt, or an innocent man seeking to make the questioning stop? The judge instructed the all-male jury that they had two options, quote, "This must be manslaughter or acquittal. This is not a case of murder because of his diminished responsibility." A lull descended over the courtroom as the jurors exited to consider their verdict. Returning an hour and 50 minutes later, they found Hale guilty of manslaughter. Upon hearing their decision, the judge advised that Hales would be sent to a facility which was equipped to handle individuals who were considered to be a danger to the public but have mental disorders which require treatment. The nature of his hospitalization would be decided by two doctors, who would determine that Hale should be held at Rampton Psychiatric Hospital for an indefinite term. In the aftermath of the trial, details would emerge regarding the 23-year-old Lorna, who still lived at home with his parents, and his only companion seemed to be Flash, his black and brown dog. Hale and his hound were often seen walking together along the beaches or the riverbank. He was such a familiar presence that Gary had likely seen him and the dog on many occasions, although whether the pair ever interacted is uncertain. While Hale was a loner at home, he was well thought of at the coal yard where he worked, although he had spun a web of fantasies, with his manager, Mr. John Alexander, recalling that, quote, "His talk of the wedding and 2 children he had were so convincing we all believed him," adding, "The longer he was here, the more details he used to embroider to the story, but he never contradicted himself. We were genuinely sorry for the lad when he said the marriage was breaking up and he was getting a divorce." But none of this was true. There was no wife or children, just him and his dog. However, since he entered the coal yard 7 months prior seeking work, he had endeared himself to Mr. Alexander, developing an amiable relationship, with his manager stating, "He worked well and honestly, if a bit slow, going on to admit after the trial that if this had not happened, Paul would still be with us. It baffled many as to how this quiet, unassuming man could have committed such a heinous crime. But incidents in his childhood spoke of his inability to regulate his emotions. He had explosions of violence which saw him damaging furniture, mingled with bouts of silently sulking. The troubled child attended the private school, where Gary would be a pupil many years later. After this, Paul went on to Marsden High School. He presented as an articulate young boy who appeared to have no issues in literacy. This only shrouded the psychological issues that lay beneath. He did have a destructive nature. At one time he had cut the fabric on a set of chairs with a knife, and had developed a habit of extinguishing cigarettes on his headboard. At one stage he was provided with psychiatric treatment, but this was mild and short-lived, and by the age of 16, Hales found himself facing the world outside of school, flitting from job to job, and enduring prolonged periods without work. He did not seem to form any romantic connections, and friendships were paid for rather than built, with him forming acquaintances with individuals who would accept his offer to buy drinks, but when his money dried up, the companions disappeared. As for those who lived near to Hales, one neighbour recalled, "We regarded him as a weirdo and an oddball, but not at all dangerous." But after considering his conviction, they added, "Looking back, perhaps we should have seen the signs, but he was just another face across the estate, and we just accepted his mannerisms." While the pain of Gary's loved ones must always be considered, there are others who suffer in cases such as this, including the Hales family, ordinary working people whose son had his troubles, but they could never have perceived he was capable of harming a child. That was especially the case with his sister Anne, who recalled how devoted he was to her two children. His father also struggled to come to terms with what had happened. The stress took its toll, and he suffered 3 heart attacks in the space of 1 week, rendering him unable to return to his role as a plumber at a nearby shipyard. While still recovering, Paul's father would speak to the press in the days following the verdict. First, he thanked his neighbours for their support, before going on to discuss how they had been seeking psychological help for their son over many years, stating, "We asked for help, but ours was a voice in the wilderness." I would not say Paul needed to go to a special school, but he did need help. As the town of North Shields slipped back into the rigour of daily life, believing a child killer was no longer prowling the streets, the case would be cast back into the headlines just 7 months after the trial had concluded. On the 21st of October 1975, the Wolverhampton Express and Star reported that a man who had been one of the original suspects in the Gary Shields investigation was on remand at Durham Prison awaiting trial for what was later revealed to be sexual offences against children. While there, he was interviewed by DS Brian Johnson, during which the man confessed to killing Gary but swiftly withdrew his admission. The paper went on to report that the details of this confession and its retraction would be forwarded to the Department of Public Prosecutions, indicating that the police believed it may have been a viable admission of guilt. The Hales family hoped this would lead to their son's conviction being overturned. Meanwhile, Gary's family had to face the horrific prospect that they may have to face another trial. That fear came to fruition in May 1976, when the Court of Appeal found Paul Hale's conviction unsafe, in light of the confession made by the man at Durham Prison, who had since been found guilty of committing sexual offences against children. The appeal judge found that this confession was more convincing than the one Hales had provided, and he expressed his belief that if the jury at Hales's trial had heard about the confession, it was, quote, inconceivable that they would have convicted Hales. He did, however, add the caveat that just because the new confession was convincing, it did not make it true, and further investigation would be required before any action against the individual could be taken. The individual in question was likely known to the Shields family, and had appeared at Hales's trial as a prosecution witness. Kenneth Woodhouse had been the one who claimed he did not recognise the sheet and smock that had been found with the body, a claim contradicted by his mother, who recalled she had hung them on the washing line the day before. While Hales had failed to explain the presence of these items during the police interviews, it was claimed that in his confession, Woodhouse had provided details which disclosed an intimate knowledge of the crime. Woodhouse alleged that on the evening of the 3rd of August 1974, Gary had visited his home and asked for money, receiving a slap from Woodhouse as a reply. Yet this allegedly caused the 6-year-old to become hysterical, and so Woodhouse placed his hands around the boy's throat until the child became quiet. Realising that Gary was now limp and unresponsive, Woodhouse claimed he panicked, tore the clothes off the boy's body and burned them. Then later that night he wrapped up the body and placed it in a laundry bag, which he then took to the thicket at a time when he knew no one would be around, going on to admit the sheet and smock that were found beside the remains did actually belong to his mother. Despite making the statement, he later retracted it, explaining to the police that it was all lies made up to punish himself because he felt ashamed and remorseful for the sexual assaults he had carried out on other children. The news of the conviction being overturned brought joy to the Hales family, and his former manager at the coal yard told the press that Paul would have a job waiting for him upon his release. Yet the same joy could not be shared by Gary's family, who had believed his killer had been caught. When they were first informed of Woodhouse's prison confession, they were assured that it wouldn't change anything, only for them to go on to see the man convicted of Gary's murder walk free several months later, after which they were then given the devastating news that there was no certainty that Woodhouse would be brought to trial. They must have felt, as do I, that it is astounding that the confession was deemed sufficient to overturn Hale's conviction, yet wasn't enough to bring the confessor before the court. However, this is likely because a higher burden of proof was required. Shortly after Hale's acquittal, it was revealed that the case would be reopened in an effort to bring the true killer to justice, with Detective Chief Superintendent Alan Bailey stating, "Everything has been gone through with a fine-tooth comb many times. But if there is the slightest flaw in the mass of material, then it will be thoroughly investigated. We will stop at nothing to see this matter is finally and fairly settled." Yet 6 months after this announcement, there seemed to be little progress made in the case, with Gary's father Calvin expressing his frustration, quote, "Nothing has been done. The police have done their job. It's the law that stinks." That statement was made on the 25th of November 1976, and I would love to say there have been further developments in the case, but I have found very little in the way of updates. I cannot find what happened to Kenneth Woodhouse, and aside from the appeals for information every few years, the murder of Gary Shields is considered an unsolved case. Could Woodhouse have been responsible, but a lack of evidence meant he could not be brought to trial? Or is it possible that Hales was in fact the perpetrator? Or has the killer of 6-year-old Gary Shields gone undetected all these years, while his loved ones continue to seek answers and hope that one day soon the real culprit will be convicted? If you think you have any information regarding this case, please contact Northumbria Police via its website or by calling 101. Alternatively, you can speak anonymously to the independent charity Crime Stoppers on 0800 555 111. Thank you for listening to this instalment of It's Murder Up North. Join me next time as we venture back across the Tyne to South Shields and the murder of a recently married woman. So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.